So great. Welcome everyone to the Global Health Lecture Series. I think it's going to be an interesting topic today. You know, it's very interesting because the Center for Global Health sometimes puts out topics that are what seems to be beyond global health. But I will say that violence is probably one of the most neglected public health problems we have, and that we don't, take a good look at it as it should be. And I don't only call it a big burden of public health, but actually it's probably one of the major disruptors also. And it's a pleasure here to have Dr. David Akerson. He is a lecturer at the Denver University in criminal law and justice and international law. And he has had a remarkable career helping out prosecuting many of the major genocides that we know today. He started his career from the apartheid era, I guess, to then the Yugoslavian genocide to the Rwandan genocide, and I think it's a remarkable step towards this. And he's going to talk to us about Rwanda and what is 20 years later, how the genocide impacted the process and the post-conflict justice. I come from a country that also suffered some genocide in Guatemala, so I know what that meant for public health in terms of not only of the violence causing a lot of trouble, but actually disrupting the public health system. And 25 years later, we are still suffering some of the effects of the genocide in terms of the public health infrastructure itself. So welcome. It's great to have you here, and I'm looking forward for your presentation.
Thank you very much. So, my name is David Akerson, and just to give you a little more background, I was the chief of evidence at the United Nations International Criminal Tribunal for Rwanda. So that was the United Nations prosecution court that we set up to prosecute the bad guys of that conflict. It was an ad hoc court. It was set up to prosecute those individuals that are most responsible for planning and perpetrating the genocide. It was designed to be a fairly short-term court, but it has lasted 20 years, and it's cost us all, as citizens of the world and contributors to the United Nations, about $2 billion. So it's ended up being a bit of a bigger project than we thought. But I was there during the early days when we were collecting evidence, and my observations today are about first Rwanda when I was there, which was 1999 and 2000 and 2001. A little bit about the revolution that's going on in terms of holding planners of these mass atrocities accountable. There is a global movement to conduct international trials, including in Latin America. There's really an exciting movement where the countries, there's 5 or 6 maybe now, Latin American countries who are having internationalized kinds of courts in their domestic systems prosecuting leaders for the crimes that I'm familiar with, which are crimes against humanity, war crimes, and genocide. But then I want to talk to you a little bit, because I think this is where our lives overlap, which is what's going on in Rwanda since the genocide, because it is quite amazing. So I'll start off by saying, So I'm always surprised at how much people know about Rwanda now, but I'm going to give you a little bit of a primer just so you understand our challenges in prosecuting the individuals. So Rwanda is a tiny country, and I've actually superimposed it. This is the size, this is Rwanda superimposed on Colorado. You can see it here in blue and in the African continent. It's landlocked. It is tropical. It's basically on the equator. What's unusual about it in terms of my work as a genocide and war crimes prosecutor, and in terms of that kind of case, is that unlike many of the other African atrocities, there are only 2 tribes who speak one language. There's actually a 3rd tribe, but they're really small, and so for the most part there are 2 significant tribes, the Hutus and the Tutsis in Rwanda. The Hutus are about 85 to 90% of the population, and the Tutsis are about 10% of the population. But although they saw themselves as distinct ethnic groups, they also had more similarities than differences. They spoke the same language, they went to the same church, they basically had the same culture. There were some, they call them pastoralists or cattlemen, cattle herders, and there were some farmers, but almost all the farmers had cattle, and almost all the cattlemen or the cattle herders, people who raise cattle, what do you call them? People who raise cattle, they all had farms as well. So, unlike a lot of conflicts where you're talking about two distinct cultures who had animosity and historical acrimony, Rwanda was very different in the fact that when we had to look at these two ethnic groups, when we began to prosecute the people we identified as the planners of the genocide, the first thing the defense counsel said to us was, these aren't different ethnic groups, and you can't prove that this was an ethnically motivated conflict. And so our challenge was, okay, how do you prove ethnic group? And almost everything that we did research on and investigated was not that strong of evidence in favor of the idea that these were two ethnic groups. So we ultimately relied on the fact that they saw themselves distinct at some level and began to target each other on this almost artificial distinction. A couple of things about the genocide. So this is the 20th anniversary of the year build-up to the genocide. It takes place in 1994 on April 6th is when it starts. So at the law school right now, I'm leading a project to have discussions and events about the events that lead up to the genocide, 9 months from now. So it's the 20th anniversary. And one of the things that we like to point out at the law school and in my classes is that this was not, although the images that come at us on our computers and televisions suggest that this is tribal violence that is spontaneous. It is really very well organized and a very well planned genocide. So the evidence that we uncovered when we were in Rwanda investigating the genocide was that, very similar to Nazi Germany, these guys had, the bad guys in Rwanda, they had decided that the tensions that had existed and the struggles over resources in Rwanda had gone on long enough, and there was a very conscious, singular decision that the Tutsi ethnic group had to be destroyed. Very similar to the Wannsee Conference in Nazi Germany, where the Germans sat down and said, okay, enough with the Jews, we have to have a different solution. In Rwanda, they didn't have the privilege or the luxury of a mechanized industrial society. They didn't have a very sophisticated army, and they had to plan a very different kind of genocide. And so it was a citizen-perpetrated genocide. But they did draw up neighborhood maps. There were neighborhood leaders, street leaders. They organized down to the individual blocks, we call them blocks, of the villages in Rwanda. Identified who the Tutsis were that were living in all of the villages, and they knew who they were going to target when the genocide broke out on April 6th. They had weapons repositories that were spread around the country. I'll just take a step back and say this is the Rwandan countryside. It is one of the most densely populated countries, and almost all of Rwanda looks like this. And so, in planning a genocide in territory like this, you can see it was not going to be possible to send a mechanized army efficiently around the country, even if you had one. This had to be carried out by the people who lived in the village against their own villagers. And this is the only one of these kinds of photographs, so you can relax because I'm not going to show you any more gruesome But I wanted to point out the fact that the killers in Rwanda were 18-year-old to 24-year-old men for the most part. We did indict a woman, one of the few women that have been indicted for genocide and convicted. She's the only person to be convicted of genocide with her son. The two were prosecuted together. And she's the only woman to be successfully convicted of sexual violence because she directed the men in her village to rape the women. But I point out to the law students in my classes that the killers looked like you guys, and they had to get you to the state where you saw every civilian, no matter if they were an infant to an 80-year-old man, as an enemy that had to be eliminated. And that took some doing. It was several years in the making. They benefited from some events that happened in neighboring countries that they could exploit to create the fear. And essentially what they did is they convinced much of the Rwandan population that if you don't kill the Tutsi civilians, they're going to kill you. And then they planned the genocide. They drew up maps, they distributed weapons, they had a hierarchy. They had local leaders, they had regional leaders, they had national leaders. There were disciplinary measures if you failed to follow the plan. So it was very well organized, very well executed to the effect that the rate of killing in Rwanda, which lasts 100 days, 10,000 people were killed every single day for 100 days, starting on April 6th. And it's 6 times the rate of the best the Germans could muster with the most industrialized society at that time, one of the most industrialized societies on the planet. There were 100,000 perpetrators, 100,000 people that we considered to be low-level perpetrators that we did not prosecute at the United Nations Tribunal. We skimmed off the top 60 or 70 guys and prosecuted the people that we considered to be the guys who had contemplated a genocide and figured out the logistics and planned it. But it entailed relying on 100,000 18 to 24-year-old men. I'll take this off. And Rwanda, after the genocide, had 100,000 young guys who were killers. They had all killed at least one person. In many instances, they killed many people. So you had a society after the genocide ends where not only were 800,000 to 1 million people macheted openly, brazenly in the streets, you had 100,000 killers who were young men who were also victims themselves, right? Many of them are coerced into doing the killing. And so it's a society that, to say that it had experienced enough evil is such a dramatic understatement. But you had 800,000 victims, you had 2 million homeless. Much of the Hutu extremist population was forced out of the country and into the Congo. And you guys probably are aware that the Congo has had even more people killed from 1994 till now. It's been kind of in a constant state of conflict and rebel activity, and a lot of it is very directly related to Rwanda. The banks were destroyed. Most of the professionals in the country were killed. One of the stories about the medical profession that resonated with a lot of us at the tribunal was that there was a fairly nice hospital in downtown, or in Kigali, which is the capital city, and where the tribunal was, at least the investigations offices were located. And they had some dedicated European healthcare workers, and they were being brought victims of the genocide, people who had severe machete wounds. And they were stitching them up, and the killers would come into the waiting room and execute them in the waiting room. And so at some point, the medical staff of King Faisal Hospital had to just abandon its efforts to intervene. And many of them suffered extreme trauma as a result of it. So One last thing. So 1994, because I mostly want to focus on what's been happening since this, but the life expectancy was the lowest in the world, even in the 3 years after the Rwanda genocide, because the society was so utterly destroyed. There were massive epidemics of AIDS, malaria, tuberculosis, and a host of waterborne infections. You had these massive refugee camps in many parts of Rwanda. There were two world-renowned forest preserves in Rwanda, both that were completely razed to the ground because of the refugee camps needing firewood. Rwanda had, at the time of the genocide, one of the nicest game or safari parks on the continent of Africa, and it was basically destroyed. The land was redistributed after the genocide to all the refugee populations and the Tutsi diaspora that returned to the country. So it was a country that had no professionals, really had a devastated healthcare system, had no infrastructure. There were no teachers left. There were no lawyers. You had massive refugee camps. And it was a pretty hopeless situation. And I'm just going to spend a minute talking about what we did. So the United Nations, as part of the Security Council's prerogative, when there is a threat to peace and security, they can do anything they want. The Security Council are the P5, the 5 permanent members, and then there's 10 rotating members. They are empowered by the rest of the United Nations, which every country in the world is a member of. So it's the whole world saying, Security Council, you can act on our behalf. In this case, they said, we want you to create a court. We want you to prosecute the people most seriously responsible. So people like me, and I think there was probably 500 others at the height of the tribunal, went into Tanzania, which is the neighboring country, and we set up a court. This is one of our courtrooms. It's not the best picture, but you get a sense. It's a very European-style court. No juries, 3 judges. The cases, despite our best efforts to be efficient, took, on average, 3 years to prosecute, $30 million. So you can imagine when you're talking about a country that's devastated and in desperate need of resources to rebuild almost every aspect of its society, it was bitter in some respects for us to be operating as part of a UN mission on their behalf and spending so much money. But we did ultimately indict 90 people. We got final convictions on 45. 16 cases are still going on after 20 years. 3 people we never caught. They're still at large. One of the main financiers was a wealthy tea plantation owner, and he bought most of the weapons that were used in the genocide. He's still in Kenya. We have a very good idea where he is, but he is being protected because he's got a lot of money, and you can buy that kind of protection in certain parts of Africa. So the tribunal has had mixed success, but it did establish a couple of important things. We don't have the death penalty in any of these international tribunals because most of the world doesn't have the death penalty, and these are meant to reflect the world more than any one country. And as a result, Rwanda abolished its death penalty. It's raised its judiciary. And the thing that is amazing about Rwanda is, not just the judiciary, but in almost every level of their society. In the 5 years after I was there in 1999. I left in 2001, and it was still fairly chaotic. But the aid money started to flow in, and that's true with a lot of African countries that get a lot of aid. And somehow there is this amazing set of circumstances that have led to this phenomenon where the aid is actually being used incredibly effectively. It's delivering real results, tangible goods and services to the people. And this is a coincidence. By the way, we circulated these wanted posters during. They still are circulated. There's a $5 million reward. Most of these guys have been caught. This is, I'll just mention this guy. In the German genocide, we can point to one individual, Heydrich, as the guy who actually came up with the final solution. He's the guy who convinced his colleagues that it's not enough that we deport Jews and gypsies and undesirables. It's not enough that we ostracize them, even sterilize them. They have to be eliminated. It was a singular moment coming from one man's, you can call it ingenuity. And that is the guy that made that decision in Rwanda, that it wasn't enough that they were going to try to coexist with the other ethnic group, that they had to be destroyed. He was probably our most successful and most difficult prosecution. And one of the main differences with prosecuting a megalomaniac political or military leader in an international tribunal compared to an average criminal prosecution in a domestic setting is that these guys are very smart. They're not resorting to a life of crime because they have no alternative. They are actually ascending through the ranks of politics or military regimes because they're really effective. They're good communicators. They're canny. They have, a lot of street smarts. So this guy's name is Colonel Bagasora. And Colonel Bagasora, on the one hand, would say publicly what all of us would expect a leader to say, is that we want to stop the killing, this is outrageous, and at the same time he's doing just the opposite. But that is a huge challenge for any prosecution team because so much of the evidence is exculpatory. But he ultimately got 45 years, and he's serving his time in Chad, I believe. So now I'm going to talk about the amazing renaissance that's gone on, and this is just coincidence that the New York Times Magazine had this article on Sunday about Rwanda and all the good things that have happened. That's kind of the threshold quote that no country in Africa, if not the world, has so thoroughly turned itself around in such a short period of time. But they also said these things, that when the writer went to the capital city of Kigali, platoons of women in white gloves rhythmically swept the streets, softly singing to themselves. Traffic circulates smoothly around a giant fountain. There was no garbage in the streets, no plastic bags tangled up in fences that plague so many other African cities. And nowadays it's hard to even find a jaywalker in downtown Kigali. So we have gone in 20 years or 19 years from a society that was filled with literally, my kids say literally for everything, and now I'm starting to say too, that there were 100,000 killers in Rwanda. And now you have this amazingly orderly, organized, law-abiding population. And I went there 2 years ago to help the tribunal on a discrete mission. I was shocked. I arrived at the airport, and I was going to Switzerland. I get off the plane. I go to this very lovely passport agent. He looks at my passport. He uses a computerized system to scan it. He stamps it, and I go through in about a minute. And, I lived in the Netherlands for 5 years with the Yugoslavia Tribunal. I never got through their passport system that fast. It was so efficient. And then I go into this airport that was just a chaotic mess when I lived there. And it's efficient, it's orderly, everybody's respecting the lines. We leave the airport, the streets are clean, they're paved, they have sidewalks. And perhaps the most striking thing about my return to Rwanda is that when I left, the use of the horn in the automobile, those of you who have lived in developing countries are well acquainted with this phenomenon, but when I drove around the streets of Kigali in 1999, people began any drive laying on the horn and just honking. It was what you did. It didn't mean it was prophylactic or preventative. It didn't mean that there was anybody in your way, but you just started honking on the horn. And then everybody was honking on their horns, and then you add in goats and derelict minivans that serve as taxis, or used to serve as taxis. You had pedestrians, you had makeshift carts, and the streets were perilous at best. And now, I'm just shocked because there are street lights. People are obeying the street lights. It's like traffic somehow. They've convinced the local population that the traffic laws are in their benefit. Because I lived in Tanzania, and they also introduced traffic lights, and no one gave a damn about those things. They would blast right through them. And then I'm going to come back to that. There's a lot to this photograph that struck me. So first of all, they have sidewalks in many of the African towns. This is downtown Kigali. Downtown Kigali was always kind of an exception because it was fairly well developed, but now it's gorgeous. There are great restaurants, there's culture, the streets are paved, the sidewalks are clean, they're painted. You can see I think this is probably, they've inherited this from Belgium, that they have black and white stripes on their sidewalks. But these guys on these scooters, which they're in a lot of African countries, they are informal taxis. There are now formal taxis in Rwanda. They're licensed, they have license plates, they're regulated, they wear helmets. They actually stop at streetlights. They don't weave in out of traffic. And the most amazing thing is that police officers, they're not corrupt. They have police officers who actually are going and issuing tickets that these guys have to pay, or there are real consequences. There's no graft. It is utterly miraculous that they've pulled this off when no other African country seems to have been able to do it. I'm going to go back to this. There's downtown. This is downtown Kigali. There is a new downtown, which I'm going to talk about in a second. But the old downtown, there's construction going on. They have created an environment that is enticing to investors because they've eliminated corruption and graft for the most part. And so there's real opportunities for people who want to invest in Africa. Now there is a place. And so you have these amazing, beautiful buildings going up. We're lucky in Denver because there's a firm called Oz Architecture, and this also speaks to the quality of the leadership in the Rwandan government, that they have planned this renaissance. It's not an ad hoc occurrence. And that even went down to the fact that they are redesigning their capital city. They're building a capital city next to the current capital city. So they, like many African cities, like many cities in the world, they expand and grow in a random fashion, which means that it's hard to retroactively develop infrastructure and sewage and water in a town that has just grown up without any kind of organization or planning. So they are actually planning a new capital city that will have all of that, will be sustainable, and they'll ultimately move a lot of their essential services and a lot of their communities to this new town. And the main reason I'm telling you this is because this is how good this government is, that they are planning their future in a way that no other African country seems to be able to do, maybe with the exception of South Africa. And so it's kind of a mind-blowing experience. And the overlap for us in the law school with you in the medical school is that it's this environment which has led Rwanda to be one of the best healthcare systems, if not the best, outside of South Africa, against all odds. And so life expectancy has gone from 28 to 56. This in the 20 years. That's maybe not as surprising as some statistics for a society that's come out of genocide. But they've lifted 1 million Rwandans out of poverty. They have gone from 1994, 77% were living in poverty, and now it's less than 45%. The economy has expanded 8% each of the last 5 years. And here's two remarkable. Remarkable is an understatement, but Rwanda has the highest percentage of female civil servants in the world. To give you an idea of how significant that is. So in the United Nations, Tribunal for Rwanda, which was largely staffed by Africans from all over the place. Because it was a tribunal in Africa, it was felt probably correctly that it should mostly be Africans that staff the place. So African judges, African lawyers, and there was a few people like me that were scattered amongst them. But the professionals from Africa tended not to afford women real opportunities, right? So the stated policy in the UN was that equally qualified women will be hired in preference of men. That strong statement was necessary in order to get women a fair shake in this tribunal. And this was the most professional class of people in Africa, and it was still very misogynist in a lot of ways. And so you have here Rwanda that has the highest number of civil servants in the world and the highest number of women parliamentarians. It's the only sub-Saharan country on track to meet its Millennium Development Goals. So they've had a massive turnaround in a short period of time. The New York Times article, if you read it, they'll say they have a lot of aid that has gone into Africa, which is true. But like I said before, there's a lot of countries who get a lot of aid. Egypt gets $1 billion a year just from the United States. And they can't remotely touch any of these accomplishments. In terms of the health care, they have, I don't know if I have this here, but Rwanda's instituted a national health insurance program. 90% of Rwandans are enrolled. Now, they don't have a lot of alternatives, so one can diminish this accomplishment, except for the fact that to get any kind of national health insurance program in a country so remote, so difficult to travel around, with a population that has been deprived of education in a lot of respects, to me, it's really significant. The external assistance for healthcare is $277 million in Rwanda, which amounts to 47% of their total health spending. And so that also can seem like it's a lot of money, except for when you realize that Rwanda ranks 22nd out of 49 sub-Saharan African countries in terms of the outside money they get for their healthcare system. So they're accomplishing much more than any other African country, even though 21 other countries get more outside assistance than Rwanda gets per capita. Child mortality is reduced by 70%, malaria deaths by 85%. I mean, it goes on and on. And so here's what I want to leave you with. It's been an incredible renaissance in Rwanda. Most of this article lays it at the feet of the former general of the military who took over, who defeated the killers during the genocide, and he has been the benevolent dictator ever since. His name is Paul Kagame. I'm going to just read you a couple of quotes from the New York Times article about President Kagame. So he routinely stays up to 2 or 3 a.m. to thumb through back issues of The Economist, to study reports from villages around his, and to study reports from villages around his country, constantly searching for better, more efficient ways to stretch the $1 billion his government gets each year from donor nations that hold him up as a shining example of what aid money can do. This you'll understand more than me, but he says substantial credit for Rwanda's progress in healthcare is due to the central government, including the Ministry of Health. They have resisted pitting prevention against care, public sector against private, and vertical programs against primary care. They instead have sought to identify and address the leading causes of mortality and morbidity while expanding access to basic healthcare services. So he is a benevolent dictator. He is also seen as a war criminal by a lot of my colleagues. And the other day, we were talking about involving some Rwandan officials in our project. And somebody objected and said, you can't have a benevolent dictator participate in your project. And then this other guy said, hold on a second. We have to rethink how we define dictatorship. You know, usually people define dictatorship by how democratic the leader is elected, the president is elected. And in Rwanda, it's not very democratic. I think Kagame won the last election with 98% of the vote, or some ridiculous percentage. But the thing is, under Kagame, it is the most democratic government on the continent of Africa. Probably, are arguably even better than South Africa. And so he said, and he directed this at me because I was jumping into this conversation. He said, look, if you want to only look at the leader, you can make an argument that he's a dictator. But if you look at his whole government, this is the most democratic government on the African continent, and it's delivering services and goods to people in unprecedented ways. And so I've had to reevaluate my own view about what dictatorship means and what the value of dictatorship is. So it's part of what we're going to be studying this next year at the Sturm College of Law with our series on Rwanda. But it's, no matter whether you are going to be a fan of Paul Kagame or whether you want to have a more democratically elected president, you can't really dispute the progress that they've made in this country. And maybe we need a few more benevolent dictators in the world. So that's my presentation today. We obviously could do a week on this. There's so much going on that's exciting in Rwanda, in your field and in my field. Questions? Yeah.
Where I work in Rwanda is Kinambi, where the genocide started.
Yeah.
It doesn't look or seem to us that anything is coming out into that large area. They're still starving. The orphans are still clothless, and we have to provide minimal food and books. And I know the government now pays tuition, but not fees. High school kids have to go to boarding school and they don't have mattresses. So I'm wondering if they're focusing on the areas of population with people who have more power than these indigent orphans and orphans in so many areas over there.
Yeah. I will first say that anyone who is actually living in Rwanda who knows more about Rwanda than I do, you have to identify yourselves. You can't sandbag me like... I'm just kidding. It's a very good question. I can tell you, and I don't know the answer. I don't know their priorities. I don't know how they are deciding how to slice up this pie that has so many needs. Certain populations aren't going to get served with the same kind of priority that, maybe you and I would want to assign to them. I do know that I interviewed a woman who was a survivor in a remote village when I was investigating this case a couple of years ago, and she was a Tutsi survivor, the only survivor in her village. And she was waiting to be relocated to housing in Kigali. They're trying to relocate a lot of the isolated survivors. And that's very compelling to the government, I imagine, that they want to spend money on a program like that. It's also important at some level, but when you have competing interests, I don't know. So I'm sure, Rwanda was one of the poorest countries on the African continent. It's not going to be turned around completely. But I would be interested to know your guys' view. Do you feel like it's heading in the right direction the way it's depicted in this New York Times article?
I would say in Kinambi village, they call it Kinambi, which is a large rural area. I don't know if you have been there, but it's post office box is Kigali. Excuse me. A lot of huge houses are being built, and nobody seems to know who's buying them because they're uninhabited, but they're great big buildings. And so it's squeezing out these people, and they have nowhere to go. The people living in iron shacks and rusty this and that. So
yeah.
It's eating them out.
That happened when I was there as well. There was a lot of that going. UN is the blame for some of that because we bring in a lot of money. wherever we go.
So it's foreign investment?
Well, I don't know in this instance. I will point out for everybody else that Kanombe is the area where the airport was, and the genocide starts when the president of Rwanda, his plane gets shot down by a surface-to-air missile, handheld surface-to-air missile. And so, the trigger happens in this village of Kanombe at the airport. But at that moment, that is the signal for everyone to commence with the genocide, and all over the country simultaneously in the exact same way. There's not a single village or town in Rwanda that does not commence with the genocide. So roadblocks are put up in every street, in every village, in every town in the country. The clubs and the machetes are brought out. The lists of Tutsis in all the neighborhoods are brought out. So, in one kind of symbolic sense, the genocide starts in that village where you guys live or used to live. But it happens everywhere, almost simultaneously, and that's kind of the best evidence that we had that this was a planned and orchestrated genocide.
I'm a pediatric ophthalmologist on the clinical staff here, and I work in Kigali, which is about an hour or two west of Kigali. And I work with the very few, there are only about 8 eye surgeons in the country of 11 million people. So it's a terrible ratio. So I teach as well as take care of poor people. So I'm told by people there that even though there's less graft, as you mentioned, people can recognize a Tutsi from Hutu by name, not by looks, but by name. Like you can tell in America certain ethnic backgrounds by name. And that the Tutsis are now back in power by Kagame, and that while there's not graft, there's favoritism in the distribution of wealth toward Tutsis and Hutus. Is that something? And I question this, and I'm asking you if you help me out understanding if that's so or not.
Yeah, it's so without having done extensive studies on all sectors of government, I have a couple of anecdotal pieces of information. One of the ranking generals of the Rwandan military is a Hutu who is formerly of the Rwandan National Army that helped foment the genocide, helped foment the hate and protect the killers. And there's been this concerted effort to bring Hutus into the fold. And there's certainly in the New York Times article, there's stories about people crossing the border that are former killers that have been hiding in the Congo, and they're welcomed with open arms. So there's some evidence that that there are real, significant, and genuine efforts to incorporate Hutus into civil society in a broad way and try to diminish the ethnic identity that, it's technically illegal for anyone to refer to anyone else by their ethnicity. The ID cards are gone, but of course you can't have gone through a genocide that's based on ethnicity without that lingering. And I guess the only other thing I would say is all the witnesses I spoke to, certainly there's a lot of ethnic identity left. And so I can imagine that in lots of government areas, particularly at the local level, that there is still going to be graft and corruption. The thing that's different about it for me when I was there a couple of years ago, but also what I'm reading, is that there is a genuine effort and they're having some success in eradicating it. I don't think they've eliminated it yet, but that's the direction they're going, and they're achieving some of it. I lived in Tanzania for 5 years, and there was no effort to do it. And it devastated that society. It's like nothing can be really accomplished because everything is derailed through graft and corruption. Have you guys been pulled over by police officers there? No? I'd be curious to know. I got stopped all the time in Tanzania, and we just had a system, We knew how much they wanted to get paid. Yeah. 11 ophthalmic surgeons. Seems like a high number in Africa. Probably the highest number in sub-Saharan Africa, right? It's the low number that we would... Yes, I'm sorry.
You talked about how many people you prosecuted. I think you said there were 65 or 45 you prosecuted.
We indicted 90. We got convictions for 45.
Yeah, so what things led to you not convicting? I I guess, because I don't understand how the whole trial system works.
Yeah, it's a good question. Well, it was a real court. These are hard cases, so we had 24 acquittals, I think. So it was not a rubber stamp court where we would indict somebody and the judges would convict. So we lost cases for good reason that you couldn't find evidence. Genocide's hard because a lot of the victims who could testify to the participation, the role of the killer, they no longer are living. So there were a number of acquittals. Some cases a couple people died. A couple people we transferred to domestic authorities in Rwanda because we, upon reflection, realized that they weren't quite as significant as we thought. And 16 are still pending on appeal and various other kinds of things. But I think at all the tribunals, the conviction rate, Sierra Leone, Yugoslavia, Cambodia, the conviction rate ends up being about 70%. And I don't think that's such a bad thing because it hopefully instills some confidence in the fact that the process is legitimate and these judges they're performing as they're supposed to.
So of the killers, there's 100,000 you're estimating, 18 to 24?
Yeah, Rwanda prosecuted those guys.
Okay, so that was my question.
So the lower level killers. So if you were one of the 100,000, many of those guys were in Rwandan jails for a long period of time, and they ultimately developed this system called gacaca, which is Kinyarwandan for justice on the grass. Or something. Do you speak Kinyarwandan? No. It's justice on the grass, and there were village kinds of hearings where the community would come together, and these young men, they were now 30 years old, and if they pled guilty and fully acknowledged what they did, they would be let out of jail and their sentence would be terminated. And so a lot of guys were processed that way, but there's still a fair number of those guys in custody awaiting these hearings because there's so many of them. Interestingly enough, when you're there, I'm sure this is still the case, that the guys in the pink suits, the people who are in jail for genocide, they wear pink suits and they're driven around the country and they perform service projects. But the jails where these guys are housed, the doors are open. Like they realize they can't leave. They don't attempt to leave. It's fairly alarming when you're driving down the street and there's a flatbed truck with a load of genocidaires sitting ahead of you. They're not restrained in any way. They're just sitting there, sometimes mocking you. Yeah.
Great presentation, David. So there are many confluences, a little bit of an unfair question by you, but there are many confluences of law and public health. I mean, public health in many ways has been the control through, some sort of system of law of the public system or beneficence. So, I wonder how much we have sort of failed from the public health standpoint to set up bars for violence prevention. So, in many ways, law has benefited from public health sort of telling them, what we think is a bad issue for public health. HIV is a good example. We set up rules or legalization of certain things that will prevent someone infecting more people, but we haven't done that for violence and crimes, right?
Right.
Will there be any benefit of us sort of quantifying or exposing the problem? So,
well, Rwanda is a great example as far as I'm concerned because they're dealing with all these complex issues holistically, right? Healthcare can't be addressed until you address civil society generally and graft and corruption, violence, domestic violence, the treatment of women. All this stuff goes hand in hand. And it's one of the best examples of a country that is seeing them as interrelated problems and the solutions also interrelated that need to be addressed together. Thanks to a very sophisticated, thoughtful man / dictator. Yeah.
Was there a significant turnover in government positions after the genocide? And
100% turnover
okay.
from the genocide government to those guys all fled to the Congo. There was not it was an extremist Hutu government. They had killed off all the moderates during the genocide. So what you had left was basically a Nazi operation. And when Kagame's force, he was the general of the invasion force, the rebel army came in, they all left. So there was not a single functionary left in Rwanda, as I understand it. So all the government had to be rebuilt from the lowest secretary, administrative assistant on up.
Do you think that kind of power vacuum contributed to the great strides that we've seen in the subsequent 15 or 20 years? That the total revamp has its benefits?
I don't know if you can attribute it to that, because there's lots of, Libya has had pretty much a total turnover. Egypt has had a few turnovers recently. We've had these turnovers, and it doesn't, in those other societies, they don't have, quite this, whatever. They don't have the same transition going on to honest, functioning government. What it seems pretty clear to me is that here you have a leadership that is determined to have civil society that isn't corrupt, that is functioning. And it starts with the highest level. And he's in a position to impose it. I don't know what else you could attribute it to, because there's so many examples where it hasn't happened. Let me get a few other people, yeah.
I understand that Kagame's government has made a lot of strides, but you use the phrase the value of dictatorship. And I wonder what strides you think have been accomplished under Kagame that would not have been possible, given some of the similar qualities maybe in a society with a higher quality of democracy.
I think, given that Africa is so misogynist generally, that if you didn't have a dictatorship with an interest in achieving the ideal of having full participation of women, you wouldn't have it. You need a government, an authoritarian government, to impose that on a society that is not yet ready to have it. And I think Rwanda's in the process of being accustomed to it. But if you went to a free and full election, I think it would quickly go back to something much more modest. So that's the one that immediately comes to mind. The other thing, too, I'll point this out, because I say this to students a lot. Nazi Germany, the Jews were given a place in the Middle East to go, and they all left Germany. In Rwanda, they had to stay together. So they had to fashion this solution where the victim class and the perpetrator class are living side by side. Much more difficult enterprise to try to affect this change. Yeah.
So Paul Kagame wrote in his constitution a certain set of term limits, and his is coming up, I think, in 2017. Do you think the government will still survive if he moves out of it, or will he just remain?
Well, certainly you'll have a Hutu, because it's a Hutu majority. So if you have free and fair elections in Rwanda, Kagame will lose, and you'll have a Hutu president. And the Hutu president most likely will not have the same agenda, and so you'll have some sort of different agenda, whether it embraces a lot of the success because he's established it. But that's presuming that he allows for a free and fair election. And a lot of people are skeptical of that. But the question I'll ask is, do you think that if the Jews and the Germans were forced to live together, and the Jews were actually given power, at what point do you turn that society back over into a democracy and allow for an election? It's a tough question. So what do you guys think? Should Kagame be forced to have a free and fair election, possibly putting into jeopardy all that they've accomplished? I'm kind of curious. Who would be in favor of this stage? It's 20 years, free and fair elections. Because I can't believe you people would be in favor of a dictatorship. That's awful.
I would be in favor of him repeating, because I think they're still in this developmental stage of getting the foundation in the country. I think it's still somewhat unstable right now. So until those pillars are firmly planted in the ground, then I think you'd have some negative consequences with Rwanda.
So you're coming out publicly in support of a dictator?
For one more time.
Maybe two. Don't pen yourself in.
He's not doing things like I look at China. China's, they're kind of they elect, but they force the country to do certain things because it's just such a massive population. So but it's good. They open up special economic zones and it's helped the economy. But he's kind of doing the same things. The way I view it is he's kind of controlling, but it's towards the greater good. Because he's rebel in that country. His pictures up in restaurants and everywhere. It's like looking at now.
Right. That's always disturbing. You've been, obviously.
Light, so they actually, and I have friends in Rwanda, and they post things on Facebook and emails how much they love Kagame, and so he is viewed as a good person, even though he's a dictator, I guess. Because he's
the other thing that's amazing, I forgot to mention this, that they had to, when they were figuring out what do they base their economy on, they're a landlocked country. There's no functioning railway that goes to Rwanda to the coast. So if you were going to set out to create an economy that you could sell things to the world to make money, but you had no efficient way to ship your goods and services to the outside world, except for to the surrounding communities, which are all very poor. And they came up with it seems like a very intelligent decision that they're going to base their economy around pharmaceutical production because it can be shipped affordably by airplane. They can make it very cheaply in Rwanda, so they've set up an infrastructure around what is going to be their economy. So they're planning their capital city, they're planning their economy, they're building the infrastructure. It's just amazing, yeah. Anyways, thank you one more.
Do you believe there's seeds there for another genocide?
I think there's the potential for another genocide. This woman that I talked to, who is a Tutsi woman, she's the only survivor in that village. She's 65 years old, and I asked her, we went through her story, which was terrible, and then we were just chatting, and we were having tea, and I said, I'm just kind of curious whether the other Hutu women of your generation in this village are sympathetic to you. And she said, no, they all hate me, and they still call me pejorative names. And that was dramatic. I thought, how can 65-year-old women, not be sympathetic with this woman who has no survivors, living on her own, and is surviving hand-to-mouth raising corn? So that does not bode well for that generation anyways. The hope, so I know that stuff is still out there, right? And there's been reprisal massacres, and there still are lots of bad characters living in the Congo that poised to come back at some point. On the other hand, there's real goods and services delivered to people, roads and healthcare and education, and you would think at some point that people would see the benefit of the society as it's being constructed, and that would trump these, what are very artificial, differences that have been raised by colonialists and other entities. But it's still very, it's still there. So they're certainly not out of the woods. One of the complicating factors is that Burundi, the country below, about the same size, has the same two ethnic groups, and oftentimes what happens there spills over into Rwanda. And that's true too in the Congo, the region in the Congo that's close to Rwanda. You have a lot of the same ethnic groups and the same tensions. And so that tends to scare people when something happens in Burundi and Rwanda. So I guess I'm cautiously optimistic but realistic that it could happen again. Yeah. Thank you guys very much.